everyone, or good afternoon, just before afternoon for those of you on the Pacific coast, as I am. I want to welcome you to today's Cox Talbot lecture. I want to first introduce a bit of history about this lecture and about the organization, the National Association of Mathematicians. The National Association of Mathematicians was founded in 1969 and is a nonprofit professional organization in the mathematical sciences with membership open to all persons interested in the mission and purpose of NAM, which are to promote excellence in the mathematical sciences and to promote the mathematical development of all underrepresented minorities. The Cox Talbot Lecture was inaugurated in 1990 in honor of the first and fourth African Americans to earn the doctoral degree in mathematics. Dr. Elbert Frank Cox was the first. He graduated from Cornell University with a PhD in 1925. Dr. Richard Talbot was the fourth. He graduated from the University of Pittsburgh with a PhD in 1935. Each year, NAM invites a mathematical scientist or educator who exemplifies the spirit of Cox and Talbot in both personal achievement and service to the mathematical community. This year, we have the great honor of presenting our 2022 Cox Talbot lecturer, Dr. Robert Q. Berry. Dr. Robert Q. Berry III is the Samuel Braley Gray Professor of Mathematics Education and the inaugural Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the School of Education and Human Development at the University of Virginia. Additionally, he is the immediate past president of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, NCTM. In 2022, Berry was elected to the National Academy of Education, an honorific society consisting of U.S. members and international associates who are elected based on outstanding scholarship related to education. Equity issues in mathematics education are central to Berry's research efforts with four related areas. First, understanding Black children's mathematical experiences. Second, measuring standards-based mathematics teaching practices. Third, unpacking equitable mathematics teaching and learning with issues of social justice. And last, exploring interactions between technology and mathematics education. Berry is the lead developer of a mathematics classroom observation instrument, the Mathematics Scan, which measures standards-based mathematics teaching practices. Berry has authored more than 100 publications and has lectured and made major presentations worldwide. Berry is a two-time recipient of NCTM's Linking Research and Practice Publication Award and received the University of Virginia's All-University Teaching Award in 2011. Robert Berry received his Bachelor's of Science degree from Old Dominion University, his master's degree from Christopher Newport University, and his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And so it is my great honor as the president of the National Association of Mathematicians to welcome our 2022 Cox Talbot lecturer, Dr. Robert Q. Berry. Let's welcome our speaker.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ortega. And I really appreciate that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and get myself set up here to share my screen. And let's see how this is going to go. I think I have it correct. No, I need to change displays, right? Mm-hmm. Is that right? All right. We practiced it and I still get it wrong. So thank you so much for that introduction. And today, my talk is really going to be in this space of thinking about policies and reforms in mathematics, and particularly in mathematics education. But before we jump into that, what I would like to do, I would like to acknowledge space and place. So before I begin, please join me in acknowledging the Monacan and the Powhatan people as the traditional custodians of the land in and around Charlottesville, Virginia. Dispossessed from these lands and continue to live with that legacy. We pay respects to their elders, past and present. My acknowledgement of the Monacan and the Powhatan people reflects a commitment to a to respect and a greater inclusion through a formal recognition of those who were here first and whose continued presence is important to our future. I also would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the individual lives of the African peoples and their descendants who were forced to dedicate their labor to the construction of what is now the University of Virginia. Scholars estimate that at least 5,000 enslaved Black people worked on the grounds of the university, with many in residence, starting with the construction of the lawn in 1817 and lasting through the end of the Civil War in 1865. These enslaved people built and sustained the everyday life of the university. These acknowledgements are but one form of public intervention, but a necessary step towards honoring the monarch and empowered people and the enslaved laborers. I reflect on the injustice committed to the Native communities and the enslaved people. I honor their stories, told and untold, their descendants, past, and leaders present and emerging. And on the screen here, you see a representation of, of, of the memorial to the enslaved laborers. You also see the shield of the Monacan Nation as well. And for me, these acknowledgements help center my work and help me think about why we engage in the work we engage. I also want to acknowledge Dr. Cox and Dr. Talbot. I mean, as I look through the previous honorees, I am truly honored to be able to talk with all of you today. And so, this is something that is really dear to me and important to me, being able to have this opportunity. So thank you so much. So I will say I prepared a paper actually. And so part of this I'm going to be reading, and I hope that that you don't mind me reading part of this. And part of this I will be more of in a commentary type of space as well. And so, so I hope you can bear with me reading and me keeping track of my time as I kind of flow through this. So, an examination of past research, policies, and reforms in mathematics education suggests that much of the policies and reforms respond to economic, technological, and the national security threats. For example, the launch of Sputnik brought heightened concerns about America's national security, as well as fears that America was lagging behind the Russians in mathematics and science. Documents such as A Nation at Risk, Before It's Too Late, Foundation for Success, and Rising Above the Gathering Storms captures the driving force that framed math education policies. These documents and others like them have demonstrated frequent concerns about maintaining America's economic privilege in the global market, technological interests in advancing society, and threats to national security. So I mean, this lecture is I'm going to use a hybrid policy analysis lens, primarily informed by the work of legal scholar and critical race theorist Derek Bell. And in this lecture, to document the ways that policies and reforms in mathematics and mathematics education were not designed to address the interests of historically excluded people. I will describe the underlying connection across policies and reform to make the case that these documents were designed and enacted to protect the economic, technological, and social interests of those in power, rather than meeting the social and moral obligation of learners of mathematics. Within these documents, there appears to be a contrasting narrative between policy intention and policy enactment. So I would use a hybrid policy analysis in this lecture to demonstrate contrasting narratives, highlight how language of math education policy, when enacted by professionals, position historically excluded learners as deficit within their culture, their families, and communities. Consequently, policies and reforms frame historically excluded learners as problems to be fixed, and that if historically excluded learners adopt the values aligned with the dominant culture, then the economic, technological, and security interests of those with power are maintained. Policies reforms are more about the dominant culture's interests and less about historically excluded learners' needs and interests. So this lecture is organized into four sections. And these are the four sections: the social conditions of historically excluded learners. I will go into the theoretical framework, particularly unpacking interest convergence a little bit. I will dive a little bit to the historical perspective, unpacking the policies that relate with different reform documents. And then I will try to close this out around some concluding thoughts that kind of bring all of this together. So let me start off with just kind of defining a couple of things first. And this is the first section, social conditions of historically excluded learners. When I use historically excluded learners, I am not ascribing a sweeping set of attributes to Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and poor people. I understand that collapsing these groups into one does not acknowledge the intersectionality within these groups. However, there are shared histories and experiences among historically excluded people. Martin argued that there is a dominant discourse in research and policy documents about Black learners and mathematics focusing on a fixed set of cultural and cognitive explanation for adverse outcomes, including cultural differences or deficits, limited mathematic knowledge, problem-solving skills, family background, socioeconomic status, and oppositional orientation to schooling. Gutierrez and Irving identify similar overlaps in research and policy documents that Latinx and Black learners share. Barnhart pointed out how Indigenous culture and language were framed in opposition to schooling. Consequently, federal policies aim to civilize and assimilate Indigenous learners into American culture. Although there are differences among historically excluded learners, they share legacies of being positioned as deficit in research and policy documents. Historically excluded learners also share values and beliefs that prioritize communal and family, respect for spirituality, and interconnectedness with the world. When we consider historical perspectives to public education and policy, we see intentional policies designed to keep historically excluded people undereducated. The legacies of these policies remain unexamined to determine the impact of these policies in our current context. There were laws in southern states where it was illegal to teach Black people to read and write. As public education developed and expanded, schools became institutions to civilize, Christianize, and control Black and brown children to keep them passive to social change so they would not contribute to social upheaval. It was illegal to teach Indigenous people in their native tongue. There have been policies supporting linguistic nationalism, condemning multilingualism. Given these collective legacies, reforms in educational policies often overlook the generational impact of violence on historically excluded people. Instead, there's a narrative focused on assimilation and control, which is ever so present. A body of research in mathematics education suggests that historically excluded learners experience devaluation, inequities, exclusion, and violence. Leonardo, in quote, he says, research policies and reform has been violent to marginalized people who are represented by perspectives that are neither kind to their cultural worldview nor accurate regarding their priorities, end quote. So a wide range of explanations have been offered explaining the achievement of historically excluded learners in mathematics. including the effects of poverty, poor prenatal health care, lack of family support, poor quality of schooling, implicit or explicit biases on the part of educators. So what I want to do is just kind of contextualize this with some data and thinking about and push back on some of these explanations that seem to be ever so present in these policy documents and framing historically excluded learners. Students from Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities have disproportionately low representation in STEM fields at all levels. The projected population growth of people from historically excluded groups is expected to be more than half of the US population by 2043. The number of historically excluded learners has risen over the past 30 years, with more than half of the children as part of an historically excluded group. Black, Latinx, Indigenous individuals collectively make up the largest proportion of growth in the US STEM workforce, but are significantly underrepresented in all STEM degrees awarded. The National Assessment for Educational Progress High School Transcript Study found that high school graduates completing Algebra 1 before high school are twice as likely to complete a calculus course than those who take Algebra 1 in high school. However, only 12% of Black students and 17% of Latinx students have taken Algebra 1 before high school. A report by the College Board found that even when Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students are equally prepared for AP coursework, AP meaning advanced placement, they are still less likely to experience these courses. Basile contends that because US schools are funded locally, there's tremendous variation in calculus instruction availability in high school, with the most privileged students having the greatest access. This has profound effects on historically excluded learners because they are more likely not to have access to calculus instruction and more likely not to have access to calculus requirements by universities. Consequently, the cycle of lack of access to STEM degrees and career persists. There's a constant pattern in which historically excluded learners are routinely given the least access to advanced mathematics content, the fewest opportunities to learn through methods other than memorization and mimicking teachers, and the least access to well-prepared teachers. So research, policies, and reform must consider historically excluded learners' positionality and the many conditions and contexts in which historically excluded students exist. Schools are social institutions set up by those in power, organized to support and value the types of cultural and social capital of those in power. It is plausible to consider that since policies and reforms support the value of those in power, there may be differences in the way that historically excluded learners are perceived. Policies and reform in education often portray historically excluded learners as in need of being fixed, and that their culture, family, and communities are deprived or deficit. Bazile and Lopez pointed out a deficit positioning and negative narrative in the document Adding It Up, published by the National Research Council. And I won't go through the entire statement here, but what I want to point out is this statement here on the screen. And I'll allow you to read it for yourself, but I'll touch on some of the points here. Research has shown that children from lower socioeconomic background have particular difficulty understanding the relative magnitude of single-digit whole numbers. So they're focusing on younger kids, elementary kids. I put this quote in to kind of make the point I hope to make a little bit later. And solving addition and subtraction problem verbally rather than using objects. This immaturity of their mathematical development may account for the problems poor and minority children have understanding the basis for simple arithmetic and solving word problems. So here's the point I want to kind of push in on this statement here. The content of this quote from Adding It Up present not only data from a deficit position, but also uses language surrounding the data to position historically excluded learners in a static racial hierarchy via what may be defined as a biological deficit. Such framing, suggesting biological inferiority, is highly problematic. A different way of framing might focus on the reason for underperformance is situated in structural issues of schooling, ways that these learners may be positioned, or variable access of the people of communities to jobs, healthcare, and other resources. While the disproportionality and conditions of historically excluded learners are a cause for concern, it is important to understand that addressing the learner's circumstances may not have always been the primary goal of policies, of prior policies in math education reform. I've argued in other places that previous policies and reforms in mathematics education have failed due to having been developed to address the interests of those in power and not the interests of historically excluded people. Many past policies and reform in mathematics teaching and learning have come at the expense of historically excluded learners' needs and interests by framing policies and reform based on economic, technological, and security interests of those in power. So this first part, I just want to kind of how to frame some of the issues and some of the issues that have an impact on this population of this community and the population of students from these communities. The second part, I just want to kind of highlight my theoretical framework and how I then dig into and the lens that I use of unpacking some of the policies and reforms that I'm going to discuss a little bit later. And I'm going to be mindful of my time as well. Derek Bell, a former attorney with the NAACP during the Civil Rights era, employed the interest convergence principle to explain how the Supreme Court issued its landmark ruling of Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. In the Brown case, the Supreme Court ruling revoked the separate but equal doctrine, which legally sanctioned segregation in public education and in all aspects of daily life. Bell argued that the Brown decision was not a result of America coming to terms with its democratic ideas or moral sensibility, but instead, the Supreme Court was more interested in providing, quote, immediate credibility to America's struggle with communist country to win the hearts and minds of emerging third world people, end quote, than in doing what was morally right. Thus, under the interest convergence principle, the Brown decision is best understood as progress requiring the coincidence of a pressing issue more than a commitment to justice. So interest convergence provided analytical viewpoint for examining how power dictates policies and reform to advance those with power's political, social, and economic interests. Bell's interest convergence principle theorized that any empowered group will not help any disempowered group unless it's in their best interest to do so. For Bell, the historical advancement of Black people's needs and interests results from being fortuitous beneficiaries of measures directed at further aims other than racial equity and social justice. So interest convergence has its theoretical grounding in critical race theory, which draws from a broad literature in law, sociology, history, education, and women's studies. Historically, its roots can be traced to legal studies. In education, interest convergence provides the framework to discuss power dynamics as framed by a systemic interest and a loss-gain binary. Typically, someone or some group negotiates and give up something for interest to converge or to align. So in STEM education, when we think about this from a STEM education or even a mathematics education, and when we think about this binary, in STEM education, the binary is often framed as a negotiation for providing broader access to historically excluded learners in exchange to access to a structure leading to upward mobility. An example of this binary in STEM is the discourse for increased population of historically excluded learners in STEM careers, leading to higher paying jobs or high paying jobs with little focus on whether the climate in the STEM workforce is ready for increased diversity. The discourse must give consideration to how a diverse STEM workforce benefits historically excluded communities beyond the individual perspective, but must consider how the collective perspective of the communities will be given. This binary position of access to structures leading to upward mobility is an individualistic venture and not focused on structures and policies that marginalize communities more broadly. In mathematics, Gustain and Martin have examined several math education policies and documents using the interest convergence tenet. Gustain argued that policies and reforms are motivated primarily by the desire to maintain global economic superiority against other nations' rising educational and intellectual infrastructure. And here's an example of this. This comes from the Educate to Innovate campaign from President Obama. And here's a quote from President Obama where he says, whether it's improving our health, harnessing clean energy, protecting our security, or succeeding in the global economy, our future depends on reaffirming America's role as the world's engine of scientific discovery and technological innovation. And that leadership tomorrow depends on how we educate our students today, especially in math, science, and engineering. And so what I want to push in on this is that this framing suggests that the problems of technology and science innovation are affected by all the same or in similar ways, and that all will benefit from solving this problem. So I want to point out that the proposed solution is based on the assumption that the benefits will trickle down to all of those whose interests are being served. When we consider that US productivity has increased since the 1970s, yet income and wealth polarization within the US population has grown, we must question who benefits from the solution of such technological and scientific problems. Consequently, while the policies and reform claim success will benefit all citizens, only those with the wealth and power may be the beneficiaries of the solution to this problem. Policies and reforms are more about the interests of those with power and with wealth and less about historically excluded people's needs and interests. Martin makes a similar kind of framing where he goes on to say, Martin examined the ways in which mathematics education federal policies document how work is erased, the lived experiences of historically excluded learners. And within math education, research, and policy, race had been typically invoked only as a categorical variable and used to disaggregate data and rank students in a racial hierarchy of mathematical ability. Racism is rarely invoked. Martin found that math education policies and reform promote a market enterprise working for a selected few. He argued the status of African American, Latino, Native American, and poor students have been the primary determinant driving education reform. When discussions focus on increased participation among these students, it's usually about workforce and national economic concerns. And so again, we see this kind of, and this kind of a narrative persists in policies and reforms around technology, national security, economics, and so forth. And so the thing that I hope that we can begin to kind of think about is kind of how, whose interests are served, who's advantage, who's a disadvantage, and the framing of how we state a problem as it relates to mathematics and science and STEM more broadly. So now I just want to get to some historical perspective, and then I'm going to try to close it out. I know I'm pushing on time a little bit. So this is the third part of this, and where I hope to kind of bring it all together here. A common theme among policies and reform is the call for increased participation of historically excluded learners in mathematics, science, technology, and engineering fields. This call usually references increased and new demands of the US economy, the drive to stay ahead technologically of international competitors, and the need to secure the US from international security threats. Rarely are there references focused on the circumstances of historically excluded people and their community. Positioning historically excluded people, increased participation in mathematics to meet interests may not include their communities and commodifies them as by fixing a market value to their collective potential labor and intellectual property. In Brazil and Lopez, they describe this as what we call racial commodification. And so racial commodification is the practice and method by which racial hierarchies are replicated. So, we must consider whose interests are protected and how policies and reforms maintain protection of those with power. And I want to unpack what we mean by racial commodification. And I want to do it in using the Foundation for Success for the National Mathematics Advisory Panel's report. And here's a quote from that report. It says, moreover, there are significant persistent disparities in mathematics achievement related to race and income. Disparities that are not only devastating for individuals and family, but also project poorly on the nation's future, given the youthfulness and the high growth rates of the largest minority populations. So here's why I problematize this. In the example and throughout this document, there's little discussion of historically excluded learners' conditions, context, and experiences. There's a focus on protecting US technological and economic security interests. It appears that the document is suggesting that the youthfulness of the largest minority population seems to be the segment that needs to protect the interests of those with power. Historically excluded learners are commodified by suggesting that their increased participation in mathematics will benefit and provide potential economic gains to the US. However, it is not clear how historically excluded people will benefit. One might assume that the benefits of historically excluded people will trickle down from those in power, or that benefits might be widespread. And so here again, when you look at this document throughout, you see some language to kind of position this, but also acknowledging that the growth in the U.S. population come from populations that are typically in the range of historically excluded people, which are Latinx, Black, and other people of color. Many policy documents and reform simultaneously commodifies historically excluded population while blaming them for US disappointing performances on international mathematics assessments. And so we see this in the Innovation America. And this is a document from the National Governors Association. And you see the quote on the screen that I just want to highlight a little bit. Projected demographic shift have the potential to magnify the US problem if STEM achievement gaps are not rectified. As US domestic college population stabilizes at 30 million from 2010 to 2025, population groups currently underrepresented in STEM fields will attend college in growing numbers. If the achievement gap persists, the increased number of students will be unprepared to succeed in college and in STEM degree attainment. If you notice, there's no acknowledgement that you know that there needs to be some shift in these fields to be ready to receive a more diverse population of students as a part of these fields. And so, again, it shifts blames and commodified blame on, on historically excluded people. So I argue that such language positions historically excluded learners as responsible for U.S. international performance. By discussing the achievement gap next to international scores, this statement and others like it suggests a causal link between historically excluded learners and international performance. And so that is when we kind of problematize this is the thing that I want to kind of push in and have us to think. Oh, goodness, I am pushing on time. Okay. Policy documents and reform in math education build from the history and the legacy of protecting the U.S. economic, technological, and security interests, rather than considering the historically excluded communities and people's needs and interests. In their review of the history of school mathematics, Ellis and Berry, myself and my colleague Mark Ellis, noted a tension that reforms in math education focus on efficiencies with the emphasis on procedural learning, coupled with the belief that mathematics beyond arithmetic is reserved for those deemed capable of advancing to such heights. The focus on efficiency is found in the calls that focus on measured knowledge attainment using efficient standardized assessment. Efforts to improve mathematics education. So the idea of standardized assessments. And so, and I'm going to quote Mark and myself here. It said, situated many learners in a priori deficit position relative to disembodied mathematical knowledge, meaning learning mathematics was taken to be harder for certain groups of students due to their background or innate abilities, and failed to acknowledge the importance of mathematics for all students. And so the argument that we make here that throughout this history, standardized assessments were developed to justify the separation of students within and between schools by race, class, and ethnicity. The use of assessments to stratify was built on the assumption that the distribution of mathematical ability exists and that it can be measured fairly and meaningfully interpreted as the basis for separating students and providing unequal access to opportunities to learn mathematics. The compilation of the existence of a normal distribution of mathematical ability with societal's belief about race and intelligence cannot be overlooked. And in fact, one could argue that, this is intentional to preserve the interests of those with power. And so I just want to go back to back to the beginning here. And I'm going to go back to Sputnik. So the launch of the first artificial satellite Sputnik on October 4th, 1957, by the Russian gave the impetus for policies to improve America's mathematics education. The response to Sputnik led to federal funds in math and science education through the National Defense Education Act of 1958 to support U.S. national security interests. The National Defense Education Act provided funds to identify the best and brightest young scientific minds and was designed to fulfill defense interests in math, science, engineering, and foreign language. The appeal to identify the best and brightest was built on protecting the national security and defense interests. And so this idea that perhaps, this appeal to focus on the best and brightest, did it even in 1958, one could argue probably historically excluded communities were excluded in this policy, particularly from the National Defense Education Act, were largely excluded from having access or even being seen as part of the best and potentially brightest in this space. And so as one of the most militarized countries globally, we cannot overlook the fact that military motivation for improved mathematics and science education is still part of policy documents and reforms today. And so I just want to kind of think about how, when we think about, reforms in mathematics and we think about new mathematics, I can get to history here. It's just the reform is often built in these, I'm going to argue, in these three spaces: economic, technology, and defense. And I'm not suggesting that we not consider those. What I am suggesting, if that is our primary motivation, and not exclude and not consider the context and the conditions and the framings from which people live and grow and learn, I think we may be excluding a significant amount of talent, because we may not be, and we're not looking at, we may be excluding a significant amount of brilliance as well. And so I just want to bring this to closure, because I'm going to skip a couple of slides really quickly. A review of policy suggests that economic, technological, and security interests were the drivers of many policies and reforms. Additionally, these policy reforms situated mathematics in a nationalistic position of being colorblind, situated in a context where race, racism, condition, and context do not matter. When race, conditions, and context are not examined, schools and communities are positioned as neutral sites rather than cultural or political sites. Despite the evidence that racism and marginalization exist in schools and community, many still adhere to the belief that colorblind policies and pedagogical practices that will best serve all students. It is difficult to argue against ensuring students' competitive place in the global marketplace. However, a careful look at policies and reform focus on identifying the best and brightest, recognizing high achievers, stratifying students based on characteristics, or identifying failing schools determining merit for some and others being deficit, is highly problematic. Policies and reforms have typically not attended to or appreciate the social realities and the needs of historically excluded learners in ways that led to improvements in their life circumstances. So to have a meaningful policy gain, I argue that we must decentralize whiteness when discussing policies and reform. There's plenty of evidence suggesting that whiteness is at the center of many educational policies and reform. By decentralizing whiteness, we disrupt power and the privilege of whiteness. Decentralizing whiteness opens up the space to broaden opportunities to consider the roles of histories, context, and experiences play in developing reforms and policies. Perhaps such a reform is a grassroots proposition than facilitating policies and legislation. And I'm just going to skip a little bit because I know I'm pushing up against time here. And one of the things I want to bring to this is some I guess some forethought, some things for us to think about. Given the growing body of research focused on context, identities, experience, and the conditions of historically excluded learners, mathematics education policies and reform can draw from this body of work in establishing new policies and reforms. This body of research considers issues of race, racism, context, identities, and conditions as variables that impact historically excluded learners' mathematical experiences. This body of research challenges the dominant discourse and pushes mathematics to consider sociological, anthropological, and critical theories. It encourages researchers to consider outcomes other than achievement as the primary measures of success. One finding from this research is that educators must create opportunities for students to experience mathematics using the resources they bring to classrooms. Teachers must know and understand learners' identities, experiences, and cultural context, and consider using them to connect students meaningfully with mathematics. There is a need for policies and reform focusing on leveraging communities and community members. Mathematics occurs not only in classroom, but it also occurs in other spaces. By leveraging these resources, we situate mathematics, teaching and learning to structure experiences that are contextual, provide opportunity for exchange of mathematical ideas, and that connect with communities in meaningful ways. The use of context in mathematics can help learners recognize and build upon the cultural social resources that they bring to the mathematical experiences. And I recognize I'm pushing up against time, and I want to leave with just a tad bit of opportunity for questioning. And so I will stop there so I can do a tad bit of question. I'm sorry I talked so much there.
Oh, no
So
worries.
I'll stop sharing my screen, and are there questions?
Thank you so much. Let's just take a moment to thank our speaker. Okay, so I'm looking in the Q&A. I just want to let folks in the audience know if you have questions for our speaker, please type them into the Q&A section in Zoom. So there is one question that I see right off the bat, and this is from Dr. Brett Jefferson. Is there no benefit to the commodification of racial diversity in mathematics? This language, especially in a climate post-George Floyd, seems to help open purse strings and support for programs designed to open access for students of color.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So the idea, when you think about post-George Floyd and you think about how, when you think about commodification from that point of view, that many industries and many companies began to lend their support financially to organizations that supported historically excluded communities. And that is so there's that benefit there. So I'm not going to argue against that benefit. But what I am going to argue is that benefit, I'm wondering the short-lived aspect of such a benefit and the longevity, because issues of access is a structural issue. Does it change structures? Does it change policy? Does it change, we have to have a policy change, a policy shift, a structural change. Yes, so the commodification, it has the benefit of with an infused amount of funds for increased participation, but the next part of that conversation is, so what are our policy changes so that we can have a positive impact on communities who have been historically underserved, who have been historically marginalized? And so that is the kind of next step conversation as it relates to commodification.
Okay. Yeah, that is, I can see that as a point for sort of, just changing the way people think about funding in particular and leveraging interest convergence. But you're right, it is sort of this short-lived, it seems like it's been a short-lived change in the way that people think.
Yeah, I mean, we still need to have these policy conversations. We still need to have, and we also need to have these contextual conversations. I mean, we often hear that we need more people of color in these spaces. The question being, what are these spaces doing to prepare themselves for more people of color? And so, so you can't claim you want this thing without doing the adequate preparation for the thing that you want. And so that is the conversation I think we also have to have as well.
Definitely. We talk a lot about, just bringing in the people or the change that we want, but not how can we change ourselves so that we attract these people that we're
absolutely.
Earlier on, you had talked about how funding for public education is tied to the locality where the school is. And I was just wondering if any other funding models had been proposed.
Yeah, so oftentimes funding for education is tied to local tax bases. And so, it's tied to real estate taxes, right? And so we can see how that advantages some. because of property values and how it disadvantages others. And so what are might be other models for that? Other models for that might mean to adequately fund schools. I mean, and so, so does it, I know now I can see the argument that one would make, a states' rights argument, right? A locality argument. But I'm gonna but when we see the inequities that are glaring, absolutely glaring, I think there is a space for intervention. And how do we then provide intervention to know that we can provide just the resources that communities need? So there is a space for intervention. And so a different model might mean dismantling the current structure. And I know that is something that makes a lot of people nervous and thinking about how we might dismantle dismantle that.
So I know that we're over time. I was hoping that we could just squeeze in one last question.
Okay, absolutely.
Do you have any thoughts about the role that professional organizations like NAM, like the MAA, like the AMS can play in policy change?
Yeah,
around
I actually skipped over that part of my presentation. Having served as president of NCTM, one of the things that that we, when I was president, we put forward this document called Catalyzing Change. And Catalyzing Change, there were 3 documents, one for high school, one for middle school, one for elementary school. And it was called Catalyzing Change, Initiating Critical Conversations. And it was just a very small kind of, it wasn't a pamphlet, it was a very small document where we put forward some ideas around what are the conversations that we need to have around equitable teaching? What are the conversations around that we need to have for mathematics, whether it's content and practices and things of that nature? The idea, there is an argument that there's a lot of math in K-12 mathematics. And the question becomes, okay, if we, what can we focus, what are the big ideas? What are the things that we really need to focus on? And so the question now is, so what are those critical conversations that we need to have? Do we have too much content in K-12? Or do we need to really rethink about this? And the reason why I say that, we know in the organization of high school mathematics, I'll bring that up as an example. Typically, if you think about a traditional structure, it's algebra 1, geometry, algebra 2, and therefore, and so on. And the question is that sequence of mathematics the sequence of mathematics we should consider, right? I mean, it was based on the Committee of 10 in 1890. I think we've learned a lot about learning since 1890. So we might need to revisit that, right? We might need to revisit that, could we think about the organization of content in high school mathematics, middle school mathematics, and elementary mathematics? And so that was our intentionality around Catalyzing Change, is to kind of initiate these conversations and to really say, we've learned a lot. And a lot of what we do now in school is based on traditions and not really based on the sciences that we've learned since the implementation of those things. And so I think part of what organizations' responsibilities would be is really kind of have that conversation. The other part of it is, if we have an affinity for increased diversities, what in our organizations support, and what are some of the things that we can do to build allyship, sponsorship, and mentorship? Too often we think about mentorship, but we don't think about allyship and sponsorship. And so we can think about allyship, sponsorship, and mentorship for professionals who are coming along behind us, and provide those allyship, sponsorship, and mentorship for those coming behind us. And is our field ready for that? I mean, I could speak about math ed. There's some things that we need to grow on. We need to think about. I would like to think that we're ready, but I also see spaces where we're not ready. And And I bring that up because now I've been around long enough that I have a little bit of capital in my field. So I can say things I probably wouldn't have been able to say 20 years ago. so um, I do take advantage of the capital because I think that's what I owe to those who came before me, and I owe it to those who will come after me as well.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Bear.